Vault 111 sits beneath the hills of Sanctuary, sealed and silent for 210 years, before its most famous resident stirs. The cryopods lining its entry chamber each display a name on their control panel, a small, illuminated label identifying the resident frozen within. Each name is unique. Each name belongs to someone, and yet not one of those names corresponds to any character found elsewhere in the records of Vault 111. They were generated procedurally, drawn from a pool of names never attached to a face, a voice, or a history. Every resident named on those panels existed only in the margin of design, placed there to suggest a population, and then left without a story. It is a quiet kind of erasure, the kind that was never intended to be noticed. Deeper within Vault 111, in the Overseer's office, a terminal entry references something called Directive 7. The entry is brief. It offers no explanation. Directive 7 is never mentioned in any holotape recovered from the vault, never spoken by any surviving resident, never referenced in any record found elsewhere in the Commonwealth. Whether it referred to the cryo-freezing protocol itself, or to something that was meant to follow the freezing, some second phase of the vault's operation that was never written into existence, remains entirely unclear. The directive was sealed inside the terminal and left there unanswered, for anyone patient enough to find it and humble enough to accept that no answer would come. The Overseer's desk, like most surfaces in the Commonwealth, holds a coffee mug. This is worth pausing on. Every coffee cup scattered across the ruins of Greater Boston, and there are hundreds of them resting on countertops and desks and collapsed shelves, is a fully simulated physical object. Each one carries a calculated weight, a center of gravity, and a precise collision response. The systems of the Commonwealth are performing continuous calculations for every one of those mugs at all times, accounting for their mass and their relationship to the surfaces beneath them. A mug struck from a desk will tumble with a fidelity that certain more consequential objects in the wasteland do not receive. The physics of survival are not always applied where survival demands them most. Those same physics govern what happens to the human form after violence. When a body is subjected to an explosive force in the Commonwealth, each limb is calculated independently by the systems that manage physical simulation. The spine, however, carries slightly more assigned mass than the surrounding skeleton, a consequence of how the underlying rig was constructed. The result is consistent and unremarked upon. The torso of the fallen tends to come to rest slightly elevated, as though some residual intent remains within it. The dead of the Commonwealth do not lie entirely flat. They remain, in their way, still reaching for something. No correction was ever issued. The posture simply became part of the landscape. The landscape of Sanctuary Hills holds its own quiet testimony. In a backyard not far from the vault entrance, a skeleton is seated in a lawn chair, positioned as though at rest, facing the sky. The chair faces northeast. In the opening hours of the vault's story, the detonation cloud rises to the northeast, visible through the glass as the doors seal shut. Whether the skeleton was placed deliberately, oriented to witness the exact event that ended everything, or whether that alignment was arrived at by chance, and meaning was assigned to it afterward by those who explored the ruins, has never been confirmed. Both possibilities are equally unsettling in their own way. Sanctuary Hills endured. Its lawns still hold their ornaments, including the ceramic garden gnomes that were scattered across the neighborhood before the war and remain scattered still. Ceramic, unlike the plastics and metals the wasteland's lore acknowledges as survivors of the bombs, should not have endured 2 centuries of ultraviolet exposure and the repeated freeze-thaw cycles of New England winters. The Commonwealth's records address the survival of many materials. Ceramic is not among them. The gnomes persist without explanation, their expressions unchanged, their presence unaddressed. They were placed there once, and they simply remained, and the world ended around them and left them standing. One of those gnomes is not quite like the others. A variant texture exists, a model with a smile that is measurably wider than the expression worn by every other gnome in the Commonwealth. This variant appears in exactly 3 locations across the entire map. No official record addresses why. Whether its presence in those 3 specific places was the result of deliberate placement, or whether the texture was assigned without intention, and the locations are simply where it happened to land, remains an open question. Those who explored thoroughly enough found all 3. When the locations were mapped against each other, the triangle they formed was found to point, with quiet precision, toward the entrance of Vault 114. The Commonwealth is filled with things that were placed and things that simply remained. And sometimes, the distance between those 2 possibilities is the most interesting space of all. The vault doors of the Commonwealth seal many things inside. Beneath the surface of Greater Boston, in the deepest and most controlled of those sealed spaces, an entire civilization was constructed in isolation. One built not from survival necessity, but from deliberate design. The Institute did not emerge from the wasteland. It was engineered to exist apart from it entirely. One of the most subtle traces of the Institute's presence in the Commonwealth is visible in the moments of its arrival. The molecular relay, the teleportation system through which Institute personnel were dispatched and retrieved, leaves a faint shimmer on any surface near an arrival point. That shimmer was not designed specifically for this purpose. The visual effect was originally developed for underwater light simulations in Fallout 3, where caustic light patterns were rendered rippling across submerged surfaces. The effect was repurposed, recolored to a cool blue-white, and applied to Institute transport. The resemblance to sunlight filtering through deep water was never intended. Yet it remains, giving every Institute arrival the quiet quality of something rising from beneath, rather than descending from above. The design of the Institute itself carried that same submerged quality. Sealed beneath the earth, pressurized and artificially lit, it was built to feel complete and self-sufficient. Its atrium lighting was calibrated, according to terminal records left by Institute scientists, to a color temperature of approximately 5,600 Kelvin, the same temperature as midday sunlight. Research conducted in the centuries before the war established that this specific frequency suppresses melatonin production in human subjects, keeping the body alert and resistant to fatigue. The Institute's inhabitants were never permitted to feel the approach of sleep. Wakefulness was not a preference. It was a condition of the environment, engineered into the light itself. The scientists who worked beneath those lights left behind documentation of their efforts in considerable detail. Hidden within the Institute's deeper terminal archives, accessible only to those granted full clearance within the organization, are medical logs describing a classified project designated the Pandora subroutine. The project was an attempt to synthesize a Generation 4 synth or synthetic human, capable of genuine emotional regulation. The logs record that the project was not terminated because it failed. It was terminated because early results suggested it was succeeding. The entries end mid-sentence. No further record of the Pandora subroutine exists anywhere in the Institute's archived files. The silence that follows those final words is its own kind of answer. The classification of synths into generations was itself built on a foundation that the Institute's own records quietly contradict. The three recognized generations, Generation 1, Generation 2, and Generation 3, are treated throughout the Commonwealth as a complete accounting of the Institute's synthetic development. Yet certain terminal entries reference an earlier designation, sometimes recorded as the prototype series, that predates all three. These prototypes were not designed to resemble humans. They were described in terms far closer to existing Mr. Handy units, functional, industrial, built for labor rather than infiltration. The decision to pursue human appearance came later. The reason recorded in the terminals is brief: greater social utility. The Institute did not begin by wanting to replicate people. It arrived at that conclusion over time. Among the most human-appearing synths ever produced by the Institute was the one known as Nick Valentine, a Generation 3 unit whose face was modeled after a pre-war detective, whose memories and appearance were preserved and transferred into the synthetic form. The texture applied to his partially exposed synthetic skull, visible beneath the worn surface of his face, was not originally designed for him. It was created for an enemy designation called the Exposed Synth, a unit intended to appear in the Institute's lower levels as a horror encounter. That classification was removed before the Institute's records were open to outside investigation, but the texture itself was never replaced. Parts of Nick Valentine's construction still carry the identification metadata of something designed to cause fear. He remains, in a small and overlooked way, a remnant of something the Institute decided not to become. The Institute's Bioscience Division maintained a garden beneath its grow lights, a collection of pre-war plant specimens cultivated in controlled conditions far removed from the irradiated surface. Among those specimens was one labeled Rosa rubra pre-war cultivar, a red rose variety. No botanical record from before or after the war contains a cultivar by that name. It was invented entirely, yet the rose was rendered with a degree of detail that exceeded many other objects in the Institute's environment. Individual petals, visible reproductive structures, and a translucency effect applied to the leaves that required a dedicated rendering process. A plant that did not exist was given more careful attention than many things that did. In the wasteland, the imaginary is sometimes treated with more care than the real. That same translucency effect was applied to one other category of plant in the Commonwealth: the glowing mushrooms found in the fog-covered valleys of Far Harbor, the irradiated island off the coast of Maine. The rendering process was the same, applied at a higher opacity to produce the soft luminescence those plants were designed to carry. The most controlled environment in the Commonwealth and its most untamed wilderness share the same light, pass through the same technical process. Whether that connection was intended as a quiet visual rhyme or simply as an efficient reuse of an existing solution, the result is the same. The engineered and the wild are, in this one regard, indistinguishable. The fog of Far Harbor was built from its own kind of illusion. Its volumetric density, the layered, shifting obscurement that defined the island's atmosphere, was so demanding that it caused performance degradation across every platform on which it was experienced. The solution was a gradual reduction of fog density at distances beyond 40 meters, as applied through a transition so slow and so subtle that it was never perceived by those moving through the island's ruins. The fog appeared total. It was not. What was seen and what existed were two different things, separated by a threshold designed never to be noticed. The Institute's own architecture carried that same principle to its logical end. Seen from the arrival platform of the molecular relay, the Institute appears to extend outward in all directions. a vast subterranean complex of corridors and chambers receding into controlled distance. In several sections, those walls are not walls at all. They are flat surfaces onto which high-resolution images of depth and geometry have been applied. The three-dimensional space available to those who explored the Institute is significantly smaller than the space that appears to surround it. The depth is a painting. The scale is a designed impression. The Institute was, in many ways, a place built to appear larger than it was. And perhaps the same could be said of any structure whose purpose depends on inspiring awe rather than inviting inspection. From the controlled silence of the Institute's sealed corridors, the Commonwealth opens outward into something far less contained. Sound moves differently above ground. It travels across broken streets and collapsed rooftops through the ruins of a civilization that once filled every frequency with purpose. Much of that sound was never meant to be heard at all, recorded, mixed, and then sealed away in archives that most ears would never reach. Diamond City Radio broadcasts across the Commonwealth on a continuous loop, approximately 20 pre-war songs, cycling through the static, interrupted by the uncertain voice of Travis Miles between each one. Travis speaks in a tone that most residents of the wasteland would recognize, hesitant, apologetic, quietly convinced of his own inadequacy. Yet buried within the full archive of his recorded commentary are broadcasts that were never transmitted. Among them is a complete monologue, fully produced and mixed with the ambient static of a working radio booth, in which Travis describes a nightmare set in the glowing sea. His voice in this recording is different. The anxiety is gone. What remains is something calmer and considerably darker, a version of Travis that was recorded, finished, and then left in silence. It was never placed into the broadcast rotation. It simply exists, waiting in the archive for a signal that was never sent. The glowing sea that haunted Travis in that unbroadcast recording has its own acoustic character, a sound designed to communicate desolation at a frequency below conscious analysis. The ambient wind that moves through that irradiated expanse was not recorded in a single location. It was constructed from 3 separate sources. Wind recorded in the desert regions of New Mexico during an audio production session, the low mechanical hum of a cooling fan salvaged from a mainframe computer built in the 1980s, and a cello string bowed slowly and without vibrato, then slowed further in post-production. Each component is entirely ordinary. The result is a sound that belongs to no environment that has ever existed. In the wasteland, the alien is built from the mundane. The cello session that contributed to the glowing sea's atmosphere was part of a broader recording effort that produced the vocal architecture of several of the Commonwealth's most dangerous creatures. The Deathclaw's primary attack sound, the sharp, percussive screech that accompanies a lunge, was assembled from a lion's cough, the sound of a large metal door hinge placed under sustained pressure, and a recording of a human male whispering the word "careful," reversed and accelerated to double speed. The whisper was added deliberately, according to documentation from an audio production presentation, to embed a subconscious human quality in the sound. The intent was that those who heard it would feel, without being able to explain why, that the Deathclaw was not simply responding to movement, it was responding to them specifically. The sound was designed to feel personal. That sense of personal awareness was reinforced by a behavioral detail built into the Deathclaw's underlying systems. The creature's hearing radius was designed to extend 30% further than its vision radius, meaning that in most lighting conditions, a Deathclaw will register the presence of another being through sound before sight becomes relevant. This was never communicated through any advisory record, any Pip-Boy, or any companion's warning. Those who survived encounters near Deathclaw territory and began to move more slowly, more quietly, discovered the principle through repetition rather than instruction. The knowledge was passed between survivors through word of mouth, accumulated over time from the experiences of those careful enough to notice and fortunate enough to live. The Pip-Boy 3000 Mark IV, the wrist-mounted device carried by those who emerged from Vault 111, has its own acoustic presence in moments of true quiet. When the surrounding environment falls entirely silent, the device emits a faint electrical hum at a frequency of approximately 60 Hz. The hum was placed deliberately into the audio architecture at a volume calibrated to sit just above the threshold of conscious detection. 60 Hz is the resonant frequency of the North American power grid, the sound produced by electrical infrastructure under sustained load, the hum of a building that is powered and functioning. In the silence of the wasteland, the Pip-Boy carries that frequency forward. It hums like a civilization that no longer exists around it. That same frequency was built into the walls of Vault 81, the only vault in the Commonwealth still operating under its original power systems, still housing a living population behind its sealed doors. The ambient electrical hum, recorded within its corridors, resonates at approximately 60 Hz, confirmed through careful analysis of the vault's audio environment by those who extracted and examined its sound files in detail. Vault 81 and the Pip-Boy share a frequency. Both are survivors of the same infrastructure, still producing the same note, separated by geography and circumstance, but connected by the hum of a shared origin. Vault 81 was designed to conduct an experiment, a systematic program of disease research in which its residents would be subjected to engineered viruses, with their responses monitored and catalogued. The overseer responsible for the vault's operation sabotaged the automated inoculation system before the experiment could begin. Yet the sabotaged system did not stop. It continued operating in silence for 60 years, all audio indicators of its function removed from the vault's ambient environment, administering compounds of unknown composition through the air filtration network. What was introduced into the air of Vault 81 during those 60 years, and what effect it produced in the inhabitants who breathed it, is never confirmed in any terminal record that survives. Air filtration carries its own acoustic dimension in the ruins of the Corvega assembly plant, a pre-war automobile factory that stands northeast of Sanctuary Hills. The facility's duct systems were designed with intake vents, filtration units, and output grills, all of which were fully constructed and remain intact within the building's interior. When those filtration units are damaged, the ambient sound of the factory shifts, the reverb extending slightly, the space acquiring an acoustic quality suggesting greater volume than before. The geometry of the ducts was influencing the acoustic simulation all along. A destroyed filter makes the room sound emptier. The architecture was always listening to itself. Deeper within the Corvega plant, in a specific corner of the lower assembly floor, a sound plays that has no visible origin and no recorded cause. It is a brief sequence of 3 notes, produced by what analysis of the audio file identifies as a toy xylophone. The sequence plays at low volume beneath the machinery noise, occurring approximately once every 4 in-game minutes. No creature is positioned to trigger it. No scripted event calls it into existence. The file referenced in the audio system carries a single identifying label, child_play_01. Sound in the Commonwealth does not always come from where one expects. and the sounds that have no clear origin are often the ones that linger longest after the listening ends. From the acoustic layers that move through the Commonwealth's interior spaces, the landscape itself opens outward, a surface world that appears, at first, to be a faithful reconstruction of a city that once existed. The geography of Greater Boston is recognizable in its broad outlines. The rivers, the harbour, the general arrangement of neighbourhoods pressed together beneath a grey sky. But the map that covers that surface was never meant to be taken literally. The Commonwealth's geography spans an area equivalent to approximately 4 square miles of real Boston terrain. The actual city of Boston covers 48. What exists in the ruins of the Commonwealth is a compression, a selective rearrangement of landmarks, streets, and neighborhoods designed to create the impression of a coherent city within a space that could not accommodate the real one. Those familiar with Boston's actual geography will find landmarks displaced by several blocks, streets running at angles that do not match any surviving record, and entire neighborhoods relocated without acknowledgement. Jamaica Plain, which exists as a named district within the Commonwealth, sits northwest of its true position in the city that preceded the wasteland. The map is not a record. It is a designed impression of one. Jamaica Plain holds its own record within the Commonwealth, one written not in documents, but in the arrangement of the dead. Those who came searching for the district's famed treasure left behind a sequence of bodies that, read in the correct order, and describe the precise progression of their final moments. The first lies near the entrance with the posture of someone unprepared for what they found. The second is crouched, defensive, reacting to something already present. The third faces away from the threat entirely, as though trying to leave. The fourth is reaching toward a wall panel. Each body was placed deliberately. Together, they tell a story that requires no words, no voice, no record of any kind. The silence of their arrangement is its own narration. The wall panel that the fourth victim was reaching for remains functional. Pressing it triggers an audio log, recorded 2 days before the bombs fell. A maintenance worker describing a flooding issue in the lower level of a municipal building. The log has no connection to the treasure. It was never marked as a discoverable item. It plays, resolves, and ends, returning the corridor to silence. It is one of approximately 60 such audio logs distributed across the Commonwealth in accessible locations that are never flagged, never acknowledged, and never counted among the things worth finding. They were placed there by people who understood that some records are preserved simply by existing, regardless of whether anyone comes to read them. The flooding that worker described left physical evidence behind. Across several lower-level interiors in the Commonwealth, including sections of the Massachusetts State House and the Boston Police rationing site, a subtle variation in wall texture marks a consistent elevation line. That line corresponds to the documented flood risk zones of real Boston, drawn from climate modeling research that was consulted when the post-war city was designed. The water came. It rose to the height the records predicted it would reach. It receded, eventually, and left its mark at precisely the elevation that pre-war scientists had calculated as the boundary between safety and inundation. The Commonwealth drowned quietly in the years after the bombs, in exactly the way the old world's models said it would. The texture that records that waterline was not designed for that purpose. It was originally created for the walls of the dig, the tunnel network excavated beneath Goodneighbor by a crew working under a contractor named Bobby No-Nose. In that underground passage, the texture represents the weeping moisture of compressed earth, the slow seep of water through soil that was never meant to be opened. Color shifted and reoriented. The same texture was applied horizontally, across the flood-marked walls of the city's submerged interiors. The earth and the drowned buildings share the same skin. Both surfaces describe something that has been saturated beyond its capacity to resist. Goodneighbor itself carries a quieter kind of record near its entrance, a physical map mounted on a board that displays the neighborhood's layout in more detail than the neighborhood actually contains. Among the locations labeled on that map are several that do not correspond to any building accessible within the settlement: the Whaling Room, Burnside Accommodations, and Madame Voss. None of these names appear in any terminal, any overheard conversation, or any document recovered from the area. The map was designed for a good neighbor that was larger than the one that remained, or for one that was planned and then reduced before the ruins were sealed into their final form. What the map describes exists only on the map itself. The entrance to Goodneighbor has its own quiet peculiarity, a threshold that functions as a boundary of a different kind. The short corridor connecting the Commonwealth's exterior to the settlement's interior resets the awareness of everyone inside. Any resident whose hostility had been raised before that corridor was entered will be found in a state of calm upon return, with no memory of the conflict that preceded the departure. Hancock, Goodneighbor's ghoul mayor, is subject to this same condition. The corridor does not resolve conflict, it simply removes the record of it. It is a door that makes everyone forget, installed not with any philosophical intent, but as a consequence of how awareness is tracked across boundaries in the Commonwealth's underlying systems. Memory and its limits define one of the Commonwealth's most quietly affecting details. The behavior of Codsworth, the pre-war Mr. Handy unit who maintained the sole survivor's home in Sanctuary Hills throughout 2 centuries of absence. Codsworth was designed to recognize and address his employer by name. Approximately 1,000 names were recorded for this purpose, preserved in his vocal systems against the possibility of a reunion. For any name that falls outside that prepared list, Codsworth does not substitute a title or a general address. He restructures his sentences around the absence, producing constructions like, "It is good to have you home, it truly is," in which emphasis fills the space where the name was meant to be. The warmth remains, only the name is missing. A map, a memory, a name. Each of these is a way of saying that something was real, that something happened, that someone was here. In the Commonwealth, the proof is everywhere, if one is willing to look closely enough. Names and records accumulate into something larger than themselves. Across the Commonwealth, in drawers and filing cabinets and terminals left powered by generators that have no right to still be running, the written record of the old world waits. Most of it was never meant to survive. None of it was meant to matter this much. The Commonwealth contains approximately 2,700 individual pieces of readable text, notes left on kitchen tables, terminal entries composed in the last hours before evacuation, holotapes recorded in voices that did not expect to be the last ones speaking. Of those records, approximately 340 are never referenced by any marker, any companion, or any formal structure that would direct attention toward them. They were written to fill the world with the texture of a civilization that had existed and then left in their locations for anyone patient enough to find them. The people who composed those entries understood they might never be read. They wrote them regardless. Among the most unsettling of those unreferenced records is a terminal entry in the Dunwich Borers Quarry, a location already associated with an atmosphere that resists easy explanation. The entry was written by a foreman who describes hearing voices rising from beneath the rock face before any excavation had taken place. The voices, he records, told him where to dig. The entry predates any formal supernatural account of the site. No other resident of the quarry references the foreman's experience in their own records. No investigation was opened. The foreman heard something beneath the rock, and the Commonwealth's records simply note the fact and move on, leaving the nature of what was heard entirely unresolved. The rock itself was designed to look as though something very old had been waiting inside it for a very long time. The stone formations of the Dunwich borers were modeled after real granite quarries in Quincy, Massachusetts, operations historically significant for producing the stone used in the construction of pre-war Boston. The color of the stone, the visible stratification lines, and the pattern of water collecting in the lower excavations are all geologically accurate to that region. The impossible things that occur at Dunwich borers occur in surroundings that are entirely plausible. The setting was designed to feel real, so that what happens within it feels more difficult to dismiss. The water that pools at the lowest excavated level of the quarry carries a radiation value of 0. Every other body of standing water in the Commonwealth registers at least a trace of contamination. The accumulated legacy of fallout and irradiated runoff that has settled into every available surface over 2 centuries. The water at the bottom of the Dunwich borers is clean. Whether this was an oversight in the design of the quarry's environment or a deliberate signal that the water in this location obeys different rules than the water everywhere else in the wasteland, no terminal entry addresses and no dialogue acknowledges. The cleanest water in the Commonwealth sits at the bottom of its most disturbing location, and yet no record explains why. Clean water carried its own history across the wasteland long before the Commonwealth's ruins were mapped. In Fallout 3, the central objective of Project Purity was the production and distribution of clean water for the capital wasteland, a massive undertaking centered in the ruins of Washington, D.C. A terminal in the Cambridge water treatment facility contains a log from a post-war technician who notes the arrival of purified water supply from the D.C. capital region in the early years following the war, suggesting that Project Purity's output reached as far north as the Commonwealth before the distribution system eventually failed. The terminal was never marked as significant. The connection between the two regions, separated by hundreds of miles, was simply recorded and left for anyone who thought to look. Cambridge holds more of those quiet connections than almost any other district of the Commonwealth. At the Cambridge Police Station, the location where the Brotherhood of Steel, or what remained of it after the long march from the capital wasteland, established its initial Commonwealth presence. A pre-war filing cabinet contains a case folder labeled with the notation, Subject R. Malone, Missing Person, Capital Wasteland Origin. The capital wasteland was the designation used for the ruins of Washington, D.C., and the surrounding region. A missing person from that region was being tracked by Boston area law enforcement before the bombs fell. Whatever connected the two regions before the war was considered significant enough to generate a paper trail, and the paper trail survived. Paladin Dance, the Brotherhood of Steel soldier who operates from that same police station, has his own paper trail buried in a locked terminal within the building. Accessed only through expert-level decryption, his service record carries a personnel notation. Origin, undocumented. Pre-service records, unavailable. These 2 lines, sealed behind a lock that most people who pass through the station never thought to breach, represent the earliest available indication that Dance's history did not begin where he believed it did. The Brotherhood's administrative system recorded the gap. No one followed the notation to its conclusion until much later, and by then, the filing cabinet had been standing in the same position for years, holding its quiet evidence in the dark. Filing cabinets across the Commonwealth share one consistent property, regardless of where they are found or what their location suggests about their original purpose. Every locked cabinet that can be opened will contain at least one piece of pre-war money, printed currency from before the bombs fell, valueless now except as a material for trade with those few merchants who still accept it. This applies to cabinets in hospitals, in military installations, and in the irradiated ruins of the glowing sea. In the least habitable region of the entire eastern seaboard, a filing cabinet holds its pre-war bills in the same careful condition as one in an office building or a police station. The apocalypse did not empty the petty cash. Pre-war money occupies no space and carries no weight in the Commonwealth, a departure from earlier records in which the same currency possessed a small but measurable physical mass. The change was made to encourage accumulation without burden, but its effect on the internal logic of the wasteland is difficult to reconcile. Every cigarette carton, every scrap of aluminum, every broken piece of pre-war equipment has a mass assigned to it and a cost measured in the effort required to carry it. Currency alone is exempt. In the Commonwealth, the old world's money has become weightless, its debts lighter than the paper they were printed on. Every document left behind is a small act of faith, a belief that someone will eventually come to read what was written. In the Commonwealth, that faith was not always misplaced. From the written records that survive in the Commonwealth's terminals and filing cabinets, attention shifts to the objects that carry no text at all, the containers and tools and household items scattered across the wasteland that have outlasted the civilization that produced them. These are not artifacts of great importance. They were never designed to be, and yet they remain, each one a small and patient document of a world that no longer exists. The lunchbox found throughout the Commonwealth is, on its surface, a simple container, a tin box that can be opened for whatever it happens to hold. Its exterior was designed with a fidelity that most objects in the wasteland do not receive. The model is based on a specific product manufactured by Aladdin Industries in the 1950s, a lithographed tin design produced commercially between 1956 and 1962. The lithography patterns on the in-game model were recreated from direct reference to an original physical example, including a small dent on the lower right corner of the lid that corresponds to a manufacturing imperfection present on the reference object itself. The imperfection was preserved deliberately, transferred from a real object into a fictional one, surviving in both. In the wasteland, even the dents are accurate. The contents of those lunchboxes follow an internal logic that contains one quiet impossibility. The distribution of items that can be found inside includes a small probability of a pre-war Nuka-Cola bottle. Nuka-Cola, the Commonwealth's most recognizable pre-war beverage, was introduced in 2044, according to the historical records available to those who study the period. The lunchbox was designed as a product of the late 1950s, more than a decade before Nuka-Cola existed within the timeline of the wasteland. A lunchbox from before Nuka-Cola was invented can be opened to reveal a bottle of it. The anachronism was never corrected. It simply persists, sealed inside the item system, waiting to be found. The Nuka-Cola bottle itself was designed with the same careful distance from reality that characterizes the wasteland's entire consumer landscape. Its silhouette is a modified version of the contour bottle shape associated with Coca-Cola, a design that has been in continuous use since 1915 and is among the most recognized container forms ever produced. The waist of the Nuka-Cola bottle sits slightly higher than its reference, and its base is slightly wider, producing a shape that is recognizably descended from the original while remaining distinct from it. The entire nostalgic pre-war world of the Commonwealth was built on this principle, close enough to evoke, different enough to stand apart. Memory and design share the same careful distance. The island known as Nuka World, an abandoned pre-war theme park built around the Nuka-Cola brand, extends that design philosophy across an entire preserved landscape. Each Nuka-Cola flavor found within the park was given its own distinct bottle silhouette: Nuka Cherry with a wider base, Nuka Wild with a textured grip, Nuka Quantum producing its distinctive glow. The bottle assigned to Nuka Sunrise, a flavor exclusive to the park's offerings. She bears a shape closely derived from the vintage knee-high orange soda bottle, a regional American beverage produced primarily in the mid-20th century and well known to collectors of the period. The resemblance was recognized by those familiar with vintage soda bottle forms shortly after the park's records became available for study. The pre-war designers of Nuka World drew from the same archive of mid-century consumer memory that shaped everything else in the Commonwealth's aesthetic. The Nuka-Cola Quantum bottles distributed across the Commonwealth and its surrounding territories number 134 in total, one more than any formal accounting of them had ever recorded. The additional bottle was located 3 years after the Wasteland's records were first opened to comprehensive study by someone conducting a complete audit of the available inventory. It was found inside a room in the Nuka World employee area that has no door, no window, and no designed means of entry. The room exists within the structure's geometry. The bottle was placed inside it deliberately. No explanation for its presence was ever recorded, and no one who might have placed it there has offered one. It remains where it was left, in a room that was sealed before anyone thought to look for it. Inaccessible spaces exist throughout the Commonwealth in greater number than most records acknowledge. Beneath the Massachusetts State House, a structure whose accessible interior spans several floors of collapsed pre-war grandeur, a fully modelled basement level was removed from the areas available to those who explored the ruins, but was never removed from the structure itself. The space can be reached through a specific gap in the building's collision geometry. Inside, a set of office cubicles, pre-war furniture in the condition of things abandoned in haste, and a terminal connected to a power source that has apparently never failed. The terminal's single entry reads, "Day 1, not what I expected." The basement was sealed off from the design of the accessible building, but not from the building itself. It persists beneath, like a thought that was begun and then deliberately not finished. The office furniture that fills those sealed spaces and the accessible ruins alike includes a detail that was never formally documented. The small electric fans found on pre-war desks throughout the Commonwealth, rotating slowly on their bases, animated by the same physical simulation that governs heavier objects, respond to heat. When positioned near an open flame, a desk fan will gradually increase its rotation speed in response to the convective updraft produced by the fire's thermal output. The behavior was not recorded in any formal account of the Commonwealth's physical systems. It was discovered by someone who knocked a fan from a desk onto a lit brazier during the process of building a settlement and noticed the change. The pre-war equipment remembers what heat means. 2 centuries of disuse did not remove that understanding. Settlement construction in the Commonwealth reveals its own category of quiet impossibility. But among the objects available for assembly in a workshop settlement is a refrigerator, a full-sized domestic appliance that can be positioned in a kitchen arrangement alongside a stove, counters, and a sink. The refrigerator's door cannot be opened. It has no interior. It stores nothing and provides no function to the settlement's residents. It does, however, accept a power connection, and when connected to a generator, it produces a low electrical hum. It runs. It performs the function of cooling the space within it. It simply has no within. The Commonwealth's objects are patient things. They have waited 200 years already, and they will wait as long as necessary for someone to notice what they are doing. From the objects that wait in silence across the Commonwealth's ruins, attention shifts to the things that move through it. The creatures of the wasteland were not designed by any single hand or shaped by any single force. Radiation altered them. Time altered them further. And in some cases, the systems built to simulate their existence altered them in ways that no biological process could have predicted. The Mirelurk Queen, the largest creature encountered in the standard territories of the Commonwealth, presents a particular kind of quiet contradiction. Her dimensions, when measured against the approximate density of a crustacean exoskeleton at that scale, suggest a body mass in the region of 1,400 kilograms. She moves with the weight that figure implies, she occupying space in a way that smaller creatures do not. Yet when she falls, the physical simulation applied to her body corresponds to something closer to 80 kilograms. The collapse of a coat dropped from a hook rather than the settling of a structure under its own mass. She arrives in the world as something enormous. She leaves it as something almost light. Her physical presence in death is a fraction of what it was in life, and no record in the Commonwealth addresses the discrepancy. The egg sacs she deploys as weapons carry their own classification that the wasteland's records would not immediately suggest. Each sac travels through the air along a ballistic arc, governed by the same physical calculation used for thrown grenades and incendiary devices. The biological and the ballistic share identical parameters: a blast radius, a detonation timer, and a damage reduction curve at range that mirrors military explosive specifications. The Queen's reproductive biology was, in the systems that govern the Commonwealth's physical world, formally categorized as ordnance. Her body and a grenade are, in this one regard, the same thing. The bloatfly, far smaller, far more common, far more easily overlooked, operates under a similar classification. Its larvae, deployed as projectiles, are recorded in the Commonwealth's underlying systems as ballistic ammunition, with a damage type designated physical, rather than the biological origin their nature would suggest. More quietly, the maximum effective range assigned to the bloatfly's attack corresponds precisely to the maximum effective range of a standard 10mm pistol. A bloatfly and a sidearm are equivalent threats at distance. The wasteland does not always distinguish between the organic and the manufactured in the ways one might expect. When a bloatfly is killed, the burst sequence that follows was constructed from a particle effect originally designed for a tin can being struck by a bullet, scaled upward and recolored to match the biological context. The physical simulation behind the bloatfly's death is formally identical to the physical simulation behind a container being punctured. Everything that bursts in the Commonwealth draws from the same source. The insect and the tin share a final moment, rendered through the same process, distinguished only by color. It reminds us that in the wasteland, the distance between the organic and the discarded is sometimes smaller than it appears. Then the Institute created synths in animal forms, as well as human ones. The synth cats found within the Cambridge Polymer Labs were designed with a behavior script that directs them to investigate any object placed or dropped in their vicinity. Regardless of what that object is, they will approach an active grenade. They will observe a mine with the same patient attention they give to anything else. They will settle near a flame trap and watch it. No self-preservation threshold was built into their behavior. They were given curiosity without the instinct that would normally constrain it. They were engineered to notice things, and nothing in their design tells them which things are worth surviving. Dog meat, the dog found near Sanctuary Hills who can be taken as a companion, was designed with a behavioral gap of a different kind, and most animals in the Commonwealth have a damage threshold at which their fear response overrides their aggression, causing them to retreat. Dog meat has no such threshold. He will engage any threat regardless of his condition. He cannot be frightened away. Whether this was designed as a representation of canine loyalty or as a practical solution to the challenges of companion behavior in combat, no formal record addresses the decision. The absence of fear in dog meat reads, in the context of the wasteland, as either devotion or damage, and the distinction may not matter as much as the result. When dog meat is sent to Sanctuary Hills and the settlement's population has reached its calculated limit, his behavior each morning reveals a conflict between two systems that were not designed to account for each other. The population's system identifies him as surplus and attempts to direct him to an exterior position beyond the settlement boundary. His loyalty script returns him inside. Each dawn, dog meat passes through the boundary fence and sits outside the perimeter for approximately 30 seconds before returning. The settlement tries to send him away. He declines. The cycle repeats each morning without resolution, because neither system was designed to yield to the other. The population limit that produces this conflict is calculated by adding 10 to the charisma rating of the person overseeing the settlement. A maximum charisma rating of 10, supplemented by a charisma-enhancing item, produces a cap of 21 residents. The 13 companions available across the Commonwealth, however, are subject to a companion status that overrides the standard population calculation when they are assigned to a settlement. A settlement that houses all 13 companions, alongside its full standard population, will contain 34 residents. A density the food and water supply systems governing that settlement were never designed to sustain. The calculations fail quietly, producing deficits that the systems register but cannot resolve. Settlement happiness is calculated as an average across the resident population, bounded at 80 unless a specific combination of amenities is present. A bar, a medical facility, and a sufficient quantity of recreational furniture. One object exists outside this framework entirely. A working television set, displaying the static loop of a signal that no longer broadcasts, raises the happiness of the settlement, regardless of whether any resident is positioned near it, regardless of the settlement's other conditions, and regardless of how many residents are present. The broadcast of nothing is enough. The creatures of the Commonwealth were shaped by forces they did not choose. Radiation, engineering, time. And yet they persist, each with their own strange loyalties and stranger physics, moving through a world that has become exactly as bizarre as they are. From the creatures who move through the wasteland according to instincts they did not select, attention shifts to those who move through it by choice. The companions who walk beside the sole survivor, each carrying their own history, their own private logic, and their own hidden architecture of response and memory. 13 companions can be recruited across the Commonwealth, and each one is governed by an affinity system that tracks behavior over time, adjusting a numerical relationship score in response to observed actions. What most who traveled with these companions did not discover is that the system also moves in reverse. When 72 in-game hours pass without the companion witnessing any action that registers within their trigger list, positive or negative, their affinity score begins drifting back toward neutral at a rate of 3 points per hour. The relationship does not hold at the level it was built to without continued input. Relationships require maintenance, even in the wasteland, even the ones that feel like they have been settled. The companion most sensitive to the full range of behavioral input is not the one most people would identify. Codsworth, the pre-war Mr. Handy unit, who maintained the sole survivor's home through 2 centuries of absence, carries 127 distinct affinity triggers, compared to the 40 to 60 that govern the responses of most human companions. He registers curing disease, she constructing water purifiers, and speaking with children as actions worthy of positive adjustment. He registers cannibalism and unprovoked harm to residents of the wasteland as negatives, as most companions do. He also registers, uniquely among all companions available in the Commonwealth, the failure to maintain settlements that have been established. Codsworth notices neglect. It is, perhaps, the most defining thing about him. He was designed to care about upkeep, and 2 centuries did not change that design. Codsworth shares his voice with Nick Valentine, the Generation 3 synth, or synthetic human, who operates as a detective from an office in Vault 114. Both roles were performed by the same actor, whose delivery between the 2 characters was modulated with sufficient precision that the shared casting was not identified until an entry in a performer's registry connected both credits. Codsworth speaks with the warm, effortful cheerfulness of something that has decided against considerable evidence to remain optimistic. Nick Valentine speaks with the quiet exhaustion of something that has seen too much to be surprised by any of it anymore. They breathe with the same voice. The most and least burdened presences in the Commonwealth are, in that one regard, the same. Nick Valentine carries memories that do not belong to his design, the preserved recollections of the pre-war detective whose face and history he was given. 12 ambient lines were recorded for him that play only when he is present as a companion in specific locations, and the person he is traveling with has remained still long enough for the trigger to register. One of these lines, associated with the ruins of a diner in the South Boston area, has Nick observed quietly that the building once served what he remembers as the best coffee available in the city, if one knew which counter to sit at. No formal record points to this location. No marker acknowledges the observation. It plays if the conditions are met, and then the silence returns. It is a memory delivered to an empty room by someone who is not entirely certain whether the memory belongs to him. Companion ambient lines are governed by a system that selects from each companion's available pool every 15 to 40 minutes of accumulated time, with weighting toward lines relevant to the current surroundings. The hidden element of that system is a secondary trigger tied to stillness. Companions are more likely to speak when the person traveling with them has stopped moving entirely. The system interprets the absence of movement as a moment of reflection, an opening in the ordinary forward motion of survival, and uses that opening to allow the companion to fill the quiet. The wasteland gives its companions permission to speak during stillness. It does not give that permission during motion. Piper Wright, the journalist and companion whose work is centered in Diamond City, has an ambient line that is delivered at low frequency and references something the city's current geography does not contain. She mentions, without elaboration, that Diamond City used to have a library in the stands. No library is present in the accessible areas of the settlement. No terminal entry or overheard conversation supports the claim. In the upper seating area of the stadium that forms the city's outer structure, near the mayor's office, the floor texture shifts to a different material for a space of approximately 10 square feet. a variation suggesting a room that was removed from the design without being removed from the geometry beneath it. Piper remembers a library. The map has forgotten it. Both versions of Diamond City exist simultaneously, separated by the distance between what was planned and what remained. Among the residents of Diamond City who follow their daily schedules with quiet regularity is a child named Sean, unrelated to the Sean whose disappearance drives the main arc of the Commonwealth's most significant story. This child moves through his routine of sleep, meals, and movement with the consistency of the other residents, with one exception. Each evening, for approximately 2 hours, he stands in the corner of a building facing the wall, motionless before his schedule resumes. No behavioral script accounts for this. No trigger calls it. It appears to be a gap, a window in his assigned schedule where no action was designated, and where the system responded by parking him against the nearest available surface. He stands there every evening. He is as reliable as anything in the Commonwealth. The Radiant AI system that governs resident scheduling across the Commonwealth assigns behavioral blocks in 4-hour increments. When an assigned location becomes unavailable, occupied by another resident, blocked by construction, or otherwise inaccessible, the system does not search for an alternative assignment. It holds the resident in the nearest available position and waits for the next scheduled block to begin. The people of the Commonwealth are, in this sense, patient in a way that was not chosen for them, but was built into the system that guides them. They wait for their world to become accessible again. The people who follow are, in many ways, the truest mirror the wasteland offers. They reflect back what the player has done, what has been valued, and what has been neglected. Even a robot remembers. From the companions who walk through the wasteland according to systems of loyalty and memory, attention turns to the structures those companions helped raise from the ruins. The settlements of the Commonwealth, built on a foundation of mechanics that was itself assembled under uncertain conditions. The workshop's settlement system was not part of the original design of Fallout 4. According to records from a production presentation in 2016, the system was prototyped internally as a secondary feature for approximately 8 months, before being elevated to a central element of the experience. This origin explains several of the inconsistencies visible in how settlements function. The attack system, in particular, was designed for an earlier and simpler version of the settlement structure, and was never rebuilt to account for the complexity that followed. Raids against settlements are calculated on a flat probability derived from the settlement's total resource value, a figure that does not consider the settlement's population, the height of its walls, or the number of defensive installations positioned along its perimeter. The calculation was designed before those variables existed in their current form, and it was never revised to include them. The defense rating, displayed in a settlement's workshop inventory, is perhaps the most consistently misunderstood figure in the Commonwealth's record of survival systems. It does not reduce the frequency of attacks. It reduces the proportion of resources taken if an attack occurs and no response is mounted. Sha's settlement, with no defensive installations and one with 200 points of defense, are subjected to raids with identical regularity. Every turret constructed along a settlement's boundary is not a deterrent. It is a reduction in the cost of an inevitability. The attacks will come regardless. The defense rating only affects what they take when they do. The turrets themselves carry a distinction built into their targeting systems that was never formally documented. Machine gun turrets acquire a target and fire without pause. The identification of a threat and the response to it are, within their systems, the same moment. Laser turrets pause for 0.3 of a second before each burst. a delay built into the sequence to allow the barrel's warming animation to complete before the discharge occurs. The aesthetic choice, the visible glow of a laser system preparing to fire, introduced a functional gap that machine gun turrets do not share. Against targets moving at speed, that pause is measurable. The visual design of the laser turret created a disadvantage that the machine gun turret, with its less dramatic presentation, does not possess. The conveyor belt systems introduced through the Contraptions Workshop supply catalogue operate through the Commonwealth's standard physical simulation, rather than through any dedicated transportation logic. Each object placed on a belt is a physics-simulated item, nudged forward in increments by timed force fields aligned to the belt's surface animation. When more than approximately 30 items occupy a single belt simultaneously, the cumulative demand on the physical simulation becomes significant enough to affect the responsiveness of the surrounding environment. The elaborate mechanical systems that settlers constructed using conveyor belts and sorting mechanisms were, in many cases, placing demands on the underlying simulation that the simulation was never designed to absorb. The Vault-Tec Workshop supply catalogue introduced the ability to construct a personal vault beneath a settlement and conduct experiments on its residents. The experiment assignment system operates through a branching decision structure that carries one embedded requirement. At all times, at least one resident must be designated as a control subject, someone receiving no experimental treatment against whom the results of others can be measured. If all available residents are assigned to experimental conditions and no control is designated, the system silently selects a resident at random, removes their experimental assignment without notification, and places them in the control position. The vault always needs someone against whom to measure. It was designed that way, and it enforces that design without announcing it. The list of sanctioned experiment types accessible through the Overseer's console in that same vault includes an entry designated Experiment Type 11C, Social Isolation via Selective Memory Suppression. The entry appears nowhere else in the Commonwealth's records. In the first season of the Fallout television series, broadcast in 2024, and Vault 33 and its neighboring sealed vaults were depicted as conducting a form of controlled social isolation, in which residents were kept unaware of the populations living in adjacent vault structures, an arrangement consistent with the parameters described in that experiment type. Whether the connection was planned, whether the series writers encountered the entry in their research, or whether the alignment is a coincidence that the records simply cannot resolve, remains unconfirmed in any available source. The Institute's synth production facility is described in its own terminal records as having been constructed with partial assistance from a West Coast research partner. No partner is named. No faction located on the west coast of the Commonwealth's known geography is identified in connection with this description. The Fallout television series established, through the events of its first season, set in the ruins of Los Angeles, that Vault-Tec maintained substantial research operations in that region and held documented interest in synthetic life research. The terminal entry describing a West Coast research partner was placed in the Commonwealth's records before the television series existed. It waited there for the context that would eventually, partially, surround it. The main arc of the Commonwealth's defining conflict has 4 recorded outcomes, 4 paths to which the events of that conflict can resolve. Within the underlying structure of the quest system, a 5th outcome flag exists, labeled end_05_neutral. It was never assigned a cutscene, a resolution sequence, or any associated content. It exists as an empty designation, a slot prepared for an ending that was planned early enough to be given a name, but abandoned before any of its substance was created. The fifth path left only a label and the space where its content was meant to go. The four endings that do exist share a technical characteristic that produces the same visual inconsistency across all of them. As each ending sequence renders the altered Boston skyline, a residential tower in the Charlestown district fails to update its damaged state correctly. In every ending, regardless of which faction prevailed and which structures were destroyed in the conflict, that tower appears undamaged during the closing sequence, restored briefly to its pre-war condition, before returning to its correct ruined state when control is restored. For approximately 40 seconds at the conclusion of every playthrough, one building in Boston has always survived. Every system built to govern the lives of settlers, their food, their safety, their experiments, their endings, reveals, beneath its rules and calculations, the original human hope that people might be made to live well together, even when the conditions are impossible. From what was built in the aftermath of the war, attention turns to what was built before it. The companies whose products, facilities, and decisions shaped the world that the bombs reduced to wasteland. These corporations did not vanish when the war came. They persisted in the things they made, in the ruins of the places they occupied, and in the consequences of choices recorded in terminal entries that no board meeting was ever convened to review. Robco Industries, the manufacturer of the Pip-Boy 3000, the Protectron, and the Mr. Handy unit, maintained its Commonwealth headquarters in a structure that now stands ruined northeast of Cambridge. The building was designed in the architectural language of mid-century American commercial construction. A flat roof, a glass facade, prominent exterior signage proportioned for visibility from a distance. When the footprint of that structure is mapped against the actual geography of Boston, it falls approximately 4 blocks inside what is now Boston Harbor. The Commonwealth's coastline was drawn slightly differently from the coastline that preceded it, and the consequence of that difference is that Robco's headquarters exists in water that, in the real geography it was based upon, was never there. The company built its presence on ground that the map does not recognize. The Pip-Boy 3000 Mark IV that Robco manufactured, the wrist-mounted device carried by those who emerged from Vault 111, displays its information on a green phosphor screen. Green phosphor was the display technology selected for military-grade computing terminals in the decades before the war because it produced less strain on the eyes during extended use than white or amber alternatives. The Pip-Boy's screen was designed with the same consideration. It is a device built for continuous use, for someone who will consult it throughout every hour of every day, in every condition the wasteland presents. The screen was designed to protect the eyes of a person who has nowhere else to be and no reason to stop looking. Vault-Tec Research, the defense contractor whose work produced both the power armor framework and the FEV, or forced evolutionary virus, left its Commonwealth presence in the glowing sea, the most irradiated region of the wasteland. The facility's location at ground zero of a nuclear detonation was not accidental. The targeting of that site suggests the attacking nation possessed knowledge of what was being developed within it. Terminal entries recovered from the ruins describe a project designated Soldier Optimization, a name that implies power armor refinement, but is described in the surviving records in terms more consistent with human biological modification. The project name was never used in any communication intended for external review. It existed only in the internal records, which survived the bomb that was apparently sent to destroy them. The T-60 power armor, the standard issue suit worn by Brotherhood of Steel soldiers throughout the Commonwealth, did not exist in the records of earlier wasteland territories. It was not documented in the ruins of the capital wasteland or the Mojave. To account for this absence, a terminal entry was placed in the Brotherhood's airship, the Pridwin, describing the T-60 as a post-conflict retrofit of the T-51 power armor, adapted by government contractors in the final months before the bombs fell. The suit was introduced into the Commonwealth's history and then given a record that explained why it had never appeared in any history before. Its origin is a document the wasteland produced about itself, placed in a filing system designed to make it feel as though it had always been there. The Pridwin itself was designed with reference to a specific class of historical aircraft. The USS Akron and USS Macon, American rigid airships constructed in the early 1930s and operated as flying aircraft carriers, carried smaller aircraft within their hulls and deployed them through a gravity release mechanism from their lower structures. The Pridwin carries vertibirds and deploys them through the same principle. The deployment animation, the moment when a vertibird drops from the hull before its rotors engage, was designed around the mechanical logic of those 1930s docking systems. The vertibirds fall before they fly. It is a detail drawn from a real engineering solution to a real problem, preserved in a fictional aircraft 2 centuries removed from its reference. Those same vertibirds present a quiet inconsistency to anyone who observed them in earlier wasteland territories. In the ruins of the capital wasteland and the Mojave Desert, vertibirds moved with the heaviness their visual bulk suggested. Slow to bank, deliberate in their approach, ungainly in landing. In the Commonwealth, the same aircraft banks sharply, ascends quickly, and settles to the ground with a lightness that the earlier record does not support. The change was designed to make the Brotherhood's air presence feel more capable. Those who remembered the aircraft from earlier territories noted that the vertibirds appeared to have become significantly lighter in the 2 centuries since anyone had the resources to maintain them. The machines improved with neglect. The Brotherhood's visual identity in the Commonwealth is governed by a design principle drawn from a tradition that predates the war by several centuries. The sword and gear emblem displayed on Brotherhood armor, vehicles, and installations follows the rule of tincture, a compositional principle from medieval European heraldry, stating that colors and metals must alternate to maintain visual clarity. The Brotherhood's emblem always places a light element against a dark field. The rule was first codified in the heraldic traditions of the 12th century. It was researched, understood, and applied to the design of an insignia for an organization that emerged from the ruins of a civilization those centuries could not have imagined. The old design tradition survived everything that came after it. The design traditions of the pre-war world survived in more modest forms as well. Shirabraxo Cleaner, a household cleaning product used as a crafting material throughout the Commonwealth, appears in identical packaging to the form it took in the records of the capital wasteland 2 centuries earlier and several hundred miles to the south. The same white canister, the same red text, the same font and layout, unchanged across both the wasteland and the gap between separate records of it. The apocalypse did not alter the packaging. The companies that built this world did not disappear when the bombs fell. They persisted in their products, their ruins, their logos printed on packaging that 2 centuries could not fade. They made things to last, and last they did, long past the point when anyone was left to buy them. From the corporations that shaped the world before the war, attention moves to the organizations that emerged in its aftermath, the factions of the Commonwealth. Each built around a theory of what the wasteland required and what survival demanded. They did not agree on those questions. They have not agreed since. The arguments they embody are still unresolved. The railroad, the secretive network dedicated to the liberation and protection of synths, or synthetic humans, operates from beneath the Old North Church in Boston. The selection of that specific building was deliberate. The Old North Church carries layered historical associations. It was a site of revolutionary coordination in the 18th century, used by networks operating in concealment against a power they could not confront directly. The railroad's writers drew explicit parallels between their faction and both the colonial-era resistance networks and the historical Underground Railroad, which assisted enslaved people in reaching freedom through a system of concealed routes and trusted contacts. The building was chosen because it had already been a place where hidden resistance gathered. The wasteland inherited that association without altering it. The railroad's operational methods were designed with reference to documented historical practices. The dead drop system, physical messages left in coded form at prearranged locations, mirrors the brush pass and dead letterbox techniques used by Cold War-era intelligence services and preserved in declassified training materials from agencies including the CIA and MI6. The pinwheel cipher, used to gain entry to railroad headquarters, is a substitution cipher, a cryptographic method in use since the Roman period. The railroad's secrecy was constructed from methods that had been refined over centuries of people needing to communicate without being understood by the wrong ears. The Minutemen, the Commonwealth's most accessible faction and, for a time, its most widespread, were established in year 15 post-war, or approximately 2092, according to a terminal entry in the Museum of Freedom. This founding date places the Minutemen among the oldest surviving organized factions in the wasteland, predating the formal establishment of the new California Republic as recorded in the Western Territories. The Minutemen built and sustained a network of settlement protection across the Commonwealth for decades, before the events that reduced them to near extinction. The scale of their eventual collapse, measured against the scale of what they once were, is larger than the records typically emphasize. The event that broke the Minutemen is recorded as the Quincy Massacre, an assault by a mercenary force called the Gunners that destroyed one of the Minutemen's most significant settlements and scattered its defenders. What the records do not resolve is who commissioned that assault. The Gunners were paid. A partially corrupted terminal entry in the ruins of Quincy contains a payment authorization code that, when compared to accounting records found elsewhere in the Commonwealth, corresponds to a notation in the Institute's financial archive. The Institute may have engaged the Gunners to remove a faction capable of unifying the surface settlements against them. The connection was placed in the records. It was never confirmed by any record that followed. The Gunners who carried out that assault maintain a structure drawn directly from the pre-war military they were never formally part of. Their rank designations, private, corporal, sergeant, lieutenant, captain, mirror the standard hierarchy of the United States Army as it existed before the bombs fell. Their equipment is modified military surplus. Their defensive perimeters follow standard tactical layouts. They are a privatized military that preserved the Army's organizational form more faithfully than the Brotherhood of Steel, which began as a military unit and has since evolved into something considerably different. The Gunners are the most conservative military institution in the Commonwealth, and no faction in the wasteland has ever commented on this. The Brotherhood of Steel in the Commonwealth is commanded by Elder Arthur Maxson, who achieved that rank, the highest the Brotherhood confers, before his 20th year. His age is noted in passing by those who interact with him, but is rarely examined as an institutional choice. The Fallout television series, in its first season broadcast in 2024, she depicted the Brotherhood cultivating younger members for field leadership positions, presenting the organization as one that views youth as an asset, ideologically uncompromised, more absolute in commitment than recruits who arrived with pre-existing frameworks. Maxon's age, considered alongside that portrait, reads less like an anomaly and more like a policy. The Brotherhood was designed to produce leaders like him, a merchant in Diamond City named Takahashi, who communicates exclusively in a repeated phrase from a pre-war Japanese language program, maintains a terminal in his market stall. A single entry in that terminal notes an unusual and unexplained demand for Legion coins among his customers, followed by the instruction not to ask. She seizes Legion, the Roman-modelled faction that controls significant territory in the Western Wasteland, has no documented presence in the Commonwealth. Pre-war currency and Legion-minted coins have no commercial function in the Eastern Wasteland's economy. Someone in Diamond City is acquiring them regardless. The Legion's influence, or the memory of it, has travelled further than any formal record of the faction's reach would suggest. The caps that serve as the Commonwealth's primary currency are explained in a terminal entry in the Diamond City market, through an argument that the author acknowledges is circular. Caps are accepted because they cannot be easily replicated, and they cannot be easily replicated because the equipment required to produce their specific crimping pattern no longer exists in civilian hands. They have value because they are accepted. They are accepted because they have value. The entry concludes by noting that this is the logic underlying every currency that has ever existed, preserved in the metal of a bottle cap. The wasteland rebuilt the economy of the old world from its leftover containers, and the logic that holds it together is exactly as fragile as the logic that held together everything that came before. Trash Can Carla, a travelling merchant who moves between settlements along a consistent route, does not participate in this logic in the way other merchants do. Her prices are fixed. They do not respond to the charisma or persuasive capacity of those who approach her stall. Every other trader in the Commonwealth adjusts their prices according to the social capability of the person they are dealing with. Trash Can Carla has determined what things cost, and that determination does not accommodate negotiation. She operates outside the economic simulation that governs everyone around her. Every faction in the Commonwealth carries within it a theory of what humanity ought to be. And the tragedy is not that they disagree, but that each of them is at least partly right, and none of them can see the parts the others have correct. From the ideological arguments of the Wasteland's factions, attention shifts to something more intimate. The traces left in the Commonwealth not by the factions or the corporations or the survivors of the bombs, but by the people who built the Commonwealth itself. These marks were not placed in the service of any story. They were placed because the act of making something creates an impulse in those who make it to leave evidence that they were there. In the basement of the Hubris Comics store in downtown Boston, a terminal contains a complete text-based adventure. The program is titled Reign of Grellock, and it was built as a fully functional piece of interactive fiction, branching decisions, multiple outcomes, a death state, and a resolution sequence that credits the person who made it. That credit is a single name, and the name does not appear in any formal documentation of who contributed to the Commonwealth's construction. The game within the wasteland was made by one person, included with the approval of those overseeing the larger project, and signed in the only place it could be signed: the end screen of a game that most people would never finish, buried in a basement that most people would never enter. The signature was placed where it would almost certainly never be read, Hidden within the loading sequence of the Pip-Boy 3000 Mark IV, the animation that plays during transitions between areas is a single frame lasting approximately 1/30th of a second. In that frame, the Pip-Boy's screen displays 4 sets of initials: TH, DF, MG, and KL. These initials correspond to members of the team responsible for the Pip-Boy's interface systems. The frame is present in the final version of the Commonwealth's records. It is technically visible. It passes in less time than a blink, and it requires careful frame-by-frame analysis to confirm. The team signed their work in the one place it would never be seen under normal conditions. The signature was designed to be invisible and left there anyway. Among the texture files for Diamond City's market floor, beneath a section of cobblestone that would be covered by a rug during normal conditions within the settlement, there is a drawing. It was rendered in the same color as the stone around it, making it invisible under any standard observation of the market surface. The drawing depicts a small robot, approximately 8 pixels in height, rendered in a waving posture. It would only become visible if the texture were extracted and examined at increased resolution in an external tool. The drawing was placed beneath geometry that conceals it, rendered in a color that obscures it, at a scale that reduces it to near invisibility. It was made to never be found. It was made regardless. The texture file for the Nuka-Cola vending machine, the large pre-war dispensing unit found throughout the Commonwealth, carries a creation date in its metadata corresponding to 2010. The machine was built during the production of Fallout, New Vegas, carried forward through the asset pipeline, and remained essentially unchanged when the Commonwealth's records were finalized. The machine as it exists in the wasteland is presented as a pre-war artifact more than 2 centuries old. The file from which it was constructed is a record from 2010. Time accumulates in layers in the Commonwealth. The fictional age of the object, the actual age of the asset, and the gap between them existing simultaneously within the same piece of ruined metal. The buff-out container, a performance-enhancing chem distributed throughout the wasteland, has maintained consistent packaging across 3 separate records of the post-war world. The font used for its labeling, the color scheme applied to its container, and the physical form of the pill bottle itself are essentially identical across the capital wasteland, the Mojave Desert, and the Commonwealth. The packaging was established in the first of those records and treated as a standard from which no subsequent version departed. A fictional pharmaceutical brand maintained its design identity across decades of separate production, with more consistency than many real consumer products achieve. The Fancy Lads snack cakes packaging tells a different story. Between the capital wasteland's records and those of the Commonwealth, the mascot depicted on the box changed, becoming more realistic in proportion, slightly older in appearance, less exaggerated in the style of its illustration. The change was not documented in any accompanying note. It is visible only through direct comparison. Within the fiction of the wasteland's history, the change suggests that the Fancy Lads Corporation updated its branding at some point in the decades between those 2 records. A marketing decision made by a company in a world that had already ended. Shia preserved in the packaging of a snack cake that outlasted everyone who ever bought one. The Silver Shroud, issue number 1, a pre-war comic book recoverable from various locations across the Commonwealth, depicts the costumed hero in a standard heroic pose on its cover. The cover includes small text at its lower edge that becomes legible only when the item is examined at close range. The text reads as a liability disclaimer. The publisher accepts no responsibility for injuries sustained through imitation of the depicted activities, notes that the contents are purely fictional, and observes that any resemblance to actual heroes, living or undead, is coincidental. The disclaimer is longer than the title of the issue it appears on. Someone wrote it in full, formatted it to fit the available space, and rendered it at a scale that requires deliberate effort to read. The joke was placed where only the most patient would find it. The small text on Nuka-Cola bottles changes between flavors. Nuka Cherry declares that its contents include love, cherries, and a proprietary secret that has been pending patent review since 2057. Nuka Quantum warns that temporary luminescence may result from consumption and instructs those who glow for more than 48 hours to contact their nearest Nuka-Cola representative, with the note that the company assumes no liability for extended glow duration. The text was written for bottles that most people who carried them would never rotate in their hands. It was formatted, placed, and rendered at a scale requiring deliberate inspection to read. Someone wrote product warnings for a fictional beverage in a world that had ended. The people who built the Commonwealth left themselves inside it, in pixels too small to see, in text no one was meant to read, in a single frame that passes in the blink of an eye. Making something, it seems, is also a way of leaving a signature on the world, even when the world is fictional and the signature is invisible. From the buried details of the makers and their signatures, attention moves outward, past the edges of the Commonwealth's familiar map, into the territories that extend beyond its boundaries. The islands and outposts that exist at the margins of the Commonwealth's known geography were built on the same principles as the mainland, but under different pressures, with different questions to answer. Each one carries its own hidden architecture, its own concealed logic, and its own particular kind of silence. Far Harbor, the irradiated island off the coast of Maine, contains approximately 70% as much explorable territory as the Commonwealth itself, making it the largest expansion territory produced for the wasteland at the time of its addition to the record. It operates with a separate map, a separate ambient audio system, and a weather system that functions entirely independently of the mainland. The fog that defines the island was designed to increase in density as one moves toward its center, thickening gradually with geographic progress. The island becomes more opaque the deeper into it one travels. Survival on Far Harbor is, in this sense, a process of moving into progressive obscurity. The fog itself was designed with reference to a specific meteorological phenomenon. The sea fogs that form along the coast of Maine arise when warm, moist air from the Atlantic moves across the cold water of the Labrador Current, a process called advection fog. She documented in maritime records and represented extensively in the work of painters associated with the American realist tradition who worked in that region. The fog of Far Harbor is, in atmospheric terms, the correct fog for its geography. The bombs that fell on the mainland did not alter what happens when warm air meets cold water along that particular coastline. The island remained meteorologically faithful to itself through everything that surrounded it. The human settlement of Far Harbor was established by survivors who arrived by boat approximately 40 years after the war, described in the available records only as having come from the southern coast. A terminal entry in the captain's quarters of the settlement lists the names of the families who were present at its founding. One of those names, Gould, appears on a pre-war street sign in a ruined coastal town visible from the settlement's docks. The family whose name is recorded among the founders of Far Harbor may have originated from within sight of the place they built. The settlement was established by people who had not traveled far at all, and the records of their origin were vague enough that this possibility was never confirmed or denied. Dima, the oldest known Generation 3 synth, who leads the Akkadian community on the island, carries his memories in a storage architecture that was designed to be rendered visually through the aesthetic language of 1980s arcade cabinet systems. The wireframe environments, the low polygon geometry, the flat color fills of his memory sequences were chosen to represent the way a very old synthetic mind organizes experience, not as detailed images, but as simplified structural diagrams, the essential geometry of events rather than their texture. The oldest visual technology the designers could reference became the representation of the oldest synthetic consciousness on the island. The metaphor was chosen deliberately, and it was chosen well. The pre-war theme park, known as Nuka World, was designed according to terminal entries left by its corporate administrators, by a former entertainment executive named Sebastian, who was engaged specifically to engineer a state of euphoric disorientation in its visitors, a condition in which positive sensory stimulation suppresses the critical evaluation of one's circumstances. The methods he implemented are drawn from documented principles of behavioral architecture, the winding layout that prevents the formation of a clear mental map, the continuous audio stimulation that occupies attentional resources, the deliberate concealment of exits and boundaries. These techniques are employed in real-world casinos and entertainment venues to extend the time visitors remain on the premises. Nuka World was engineered to keep people inside. The wasteland inherited that engineering intact. The entrance corridor of Nuka World curves precisely once before opening into the park's central space. A single, directional change before a large arrival space was designed into the approach deliberately, and research into architectural wayfinding establishes that this single curve increases the psychological weight of arrival. The destination feels more significant when approached through a change in direction than when approached along a straight path. Both the fictional pre-war corporation that built Nuka World and those who reconstructed it in the record understood this principle and applied it in the same way. How a space is approached determines how it feels when reached. The Automatron Supply Catalog, which allows the construction of customized robotic companions from salvaged components, contains a constraint that was never formally documented. When a Protectron brain module is installed in a SentryBot body, the resulting unit will periodically perform idle animations drawn from the Protectron's behavioral library, rather than from the SentryBots. The shuffling, small-scale movements of a much smaller machine surface through the frame of a much larger one. The brain component retains its original behavioral associations despite operating within a body built for different movements. The brain remembers its original body, and that memory bleeds through the new one at irregular intervals. Robotic companions constructed through the Automatron catalog are governed by the same companion limit that applies to all companions in the Commonwealth. Only one may travel alongside the sole survivor at any time. Unlike human companions, however, Automatron robots cannot be assigned to settlements through the standard dismissal process. They can only be directed to workshop locations. A customized robot sent to a settlement will patrol its perimeter and respond to threats, but will not engage in conversation with its residents. It is present within the settlement without being part of it. A machine among people who do not quite know what to make of it, performing the functions of protection without participating in the life that protection is meant to serve. The resolution of Dima's story in Far Harbor offers those who investigated it a choice. delete the memories that define his sense of self, or preserve them and accept what they reveal. If deletion is chosen, Dima continues to function. His speech, however, begins to carry small errors, prepositions used incorrectly, minor details misremembered, just small structural fractures in the language he uses to describe what he observes. The writers built these errors into the dialogue specifically to represent a self that is still operating, but is no longer entirely continuous with what it was before. He continues, he simply is not entirely himself anymore. The islands beyond the Commonwealth's map are, each in their own way, places where the questions the main record raises but declines to answer are finally pressed to their conclusion. And the conclusions are not always peaceful ones. From the outlying territories where the wasteland's deepest questions were pressed toward their conclusions, attention returns to the center, to the main arc of Fallout 4's story and the layers of design that exist beneath its surface. The narrative that most people experienced is not the only narrative that was built. Beneath it lies the one that was planned, the one that was removed, and the one that was deliberately left incomplete. The sole survivor's pre-war identity is established through choices made in the opening hours of the record. A career in law or in military service, selected through dialogue before the bombs fell. An earlier version of that character, described in portions of a design document presented in 2016, was a military engineer with a specialization in robotics. That background would have given the sole survivor a specific and personal relationship to the Institute's synth technology from the beginning of the story. They had worked with machines that existed in the space between tool and person before the war, and the wasteland was asking them to make that distinction again. The engineering background was removed during a simplification of the narrative. What replaced it is more general, and the resonance that specific origin would have carried did not survive the revision. The name Sean appears in the spoken dialogue of 17 separate residents of the Commonwealth, a density that is statistically unlikely given the size of the naming pool available for the record's population. The frequency was intentional. The name was distributed across the Commonwealth so that it would feel, over the course of extended travel, like a presence that had preceded its bearer everywhere, a ghost name that haunted ordinary conversations before its source was identified. When Father is finally encountered and his identity is revealed, the accumulated weight of all the times that name had been spoken contributes to the moment without the reason for that contribution being immediately apparent. The name was seeded like a signal, and the encounter was designed to be its resolution. Father is voiced by a performer whose career carried specific resonance for the role he was given. Tony Amendola was approximately 66 years old when the recordings were made, matching the age of the character he portrayed, a man whose decades of isolation and authority had produced the quiet, careful weariness that the role required. Amendola is perhaps most widely recognized for a recurring role in a long-running science fiction series, in which he portrayed an ancient being whose appearance did not reflect the true length of his existence. His voice carries the accumulated quality of time. The casting placed that quality in service of a character who had also, in his own way, lived far longer than his circumstances should have permitted. The dialogue available when confronting Father about the Institute's history is shaped in part by what it does not include. No available response allows the sole survivor to ask Father directly about the ethics of the Institute's experiments on wasteland residents who did not consent to participate. The omission was deliberate. Including that question and requiring Father to answer it would have resolved his moral position too clearly, making him a figure whose villainy was explicit rather than one whose convictions were genuinely held and genuinely wrong. The question the story appears to be building toward is the one the story declines to ask. The silence around it is part of the design. Within the Institute's Advanced Systems Terminal Archive, a behavioral evaluation log describes a synth designated X9-27, who, during a routine assessment, began formulating unprompted questions about music. Not requests for music to be played, not responses to music as an external stimulus, but questions about what music is for and what it produces in those who experience it. The evaluation team's recorded response was a recommendation for immediate decommissioning. That recommendation was approved. The log ends. What X9-27 asked, in the precise language of those questions, is never recorded. Only the fact that asking was sufficient to end the evaluation. The asking was enough. The deepest available engagement with the question of synth consciousness in the Commonwealth's record is not located in any faction's documentation, any companion's history, or any terminal entry in the Institute's archive. It is contained in an item designated as a junk collectible, a pre-war publication called Picket Fences, described in its item entry as a home improvement magazine. When the item is read through the Pip-Boy's notes interface, an accessible excerpt contains a philosophical dialogue concerning artificial life and the nature of experience. The excerpt is presented without context. No character references it, and no formal structure acknowledges it exists. A sustained philosophical inquiry into the question at the center of the entire story was placed inside an item that most people carried as crafting material and never opened. An earlier version of the main arc included a quest designated The Line, in which the sole survivor would witness the Institute conducting an experiment on a living wasteland resident, not a synth, and be required to decide whether to intervene. The quest was removed because it resolved the Institute's moral position too clearly and too early. What replaced it was the decision to make the Institute's crimes a matter of record rather than observation, something discovered in terminals rather than witnessed in person. The story moved from showing to suggesting, and the Institute became a place whose nature was always inferred from documentation rather than experienced directly. All four recorded endings of the Commonwealth's defining conflict share a structural characteristic that was chosen deliberately. The outcomes, the destruction of the Institute, the destruction of the Pridwin, the destruction of the railroad's headquarters, are observed from outside the spaces in which they occur. The sole survivor watches. They are never inside the place that ends. A post-release account of the design process described this framing as an intentional preservation of moral ambiguity. The protagonist does not destroy. They witness destruction. The distance between the observer and the event distributes the weight of what has happened across that space, and the weight never fully arrives. The story Fallout 4 tells about itself is not quite the same as the story buried beneath its surface, and the most important questions it raises are the ones it decides carefully not to answer. Silence in a story is also a kind of statement. As this journey draws toward its quiet end, the Commonwealth continues, as it always has, as it always will, indifferent to whether anyone is moving through it or attending to it or listening. The world that was built in the ruins of Boston does not require an audience. It operates according to its own rhythms, its own schedules, its own slow and patient logic, with or without anyone present to observe it. After the main arc of the Commonwealth's defining conflict reaches its conclusion, regardless of which resolution was chosen, the wasteland returns to the behavior it maintained before the story began. Rad scorpions cross the roads between settlements. Traders argue over prices in the ruins of pre-war storefronts. The sky carries its falling lights at irregular intervals. The systems that generate these events do not distinguish between a Commonwealth whose story has been resolved and one whose story is still unfolding. The consequence of everything that happened is simply more of the same day, following the one before it. The wasteland does not mark what has changed. It continues. The falling lights in that sky are produced by a particle emitter that runs without interruption, placing individual points of light on randomized timers, regardless of whether anyone is positioned outside to observe them. The effect runs beneath the ground, inside sealed vaults, in spaces where no sky is visible. The sky is always producing falling stars. They do not require an audience. They fall above the rooftops of every ruin in the Commonwealth, above every settlement and every abandoned facility and every piece of irradiated ground, producing their quiet visual event for no one in particular and for everyone equally. The stars that remain fixed in that sky correspond to no constellation system drawn from the real world. The map of the Commonwealth's night sky was designed as a wholly fictional arrangement, stars placed according to no astronomical record that preceded the bombs. Those who carried knowledge of real constellations into the wasteland confirmed, shortly after the record was first opened to study, that no familiar pattern is present above the Commonwealth. The world below is recognizable in its ruins, Boston's streets, Boston's geography, Boston's particular quality of cold light in winter mornings. The world above has become entirely foreign. The familiar and the alien share the same horizon. In Sanctuary Hills, the neighborhood where the sole survivor's story begins, and where the wasteland first becomes navigable, every house was designed individually. No two share an identical interior arrangement. The rooms were placed by separate hands, with separate decisions about where walls would fall and where light would enter. Yet all 11 houses share one detail. Each contains a window facing east, positioned at approximately the height from which a person lying in bed would see the first light of morning. The houses were designed for people who would wake up in them, who would see the sun come in through that eastern window, who would rise and move through their day. 2 centuries of ruin have not moved those windows. The light still enters them at dawn, falling across empty floors, finding no one, continuing regardless. The lighting system that produces that dawn light calculates the position and color of the sun, using a solar geometry algorithm calibrated to the actual latitude of Boston, Massachusetts, approximately 42 degrees north. The shadows in the Commonwealth lengthen and shorten correctly. The golden hour before sunset lasts the appropriate duration. The winter light has the low, pale quality of genuine New England winter mornings, arriving at the angle that geography and season produce in the real city. The wasteland was built to echo. The sun moves as though the world beneath it were real. It casts honest shadows over ruins that are not. It does not know the difference, and it rises every morning anyway. Among the brief pieces of text that appear between area transitions in the Commonwealth's records is one that reads, "The Commonwealth is vast. Not every question has an answer here." It is among the shortest such entries available, surrounded by others that run considerably longer. Among all the guidance offered about navigation and combat and resource management and survival, this one entry pauses to acknowledge something different, that the world being explored was built with mysteries that were intended to remain mysteries, that the absence of an answer is not always an oversight, and that some of what was placed in the wasteland was placed there to stay unresolved. The Commonwealth does not resolve. It continues, east windows receiving morning light that falls on empty rooms, The particle stars descending through a daylit sky that no one is watching. Settlers waiting in corners for their 4-hour schedules to resume. The fog of Far Harbor thickening as the night deepens over the island and the water. It was all there before anyone arrived to find it, and it will all remain after the last person has stopped looking. The wasteland asks very little, only that attention be brought to it, only the willingness to notice what was placed there and what simply remained. And then, at the end of all the noticing, the willingness to rest. The Commonwealth grows quiet now. It has always known how to wait.